everyone. Today we have our another new episode and we have a debate. And before starting this debate, we have a lot of fun. And I'm sure today's debate will be very, very exciting because already our professional debater, they do a lot of debate on this topic and a lot of brainstorming. This is also good for our audience. So for today's debate, our topic is this house believe that climate change is the greatest threat facing humanity today. From the government side, we have our Honorable Prime Minister, Professor David Smith, Honorable Minister of the Parliaments, Professor Donald, uh, member of the government side, Mr. Marshall. On the other hand, opposition side, opposition leader of the Parliament, Professor Rob. Then we have Deputy Leader of the Parliament, Mr. Marshall actually take both of the sides. So Deputy Leader of the Parliament, Mr. Marshalls, Member of the Parliament from the opposition side, Mr. Adam, and we have our very, very helpful and very knowledgeable climate change activist who will be analyst for today's debate, Professor Paul. He is analyst for today's debate. So first of all, I want to give chance our Honorable Prime Minister of the Parliament, Professor David Smith.
Well, thank you so much. As you so aptly introduced, the topic of our discussion today is this House believes that climate change is the greatest threat facing humanity today. And, it almost, though, is that it's really a discussion, not a debate when you begin to look at the facts and the statistics around this. And that's the position that we're going to kind of take. We're in the midst of a crisis that is now. And with all the amount of information out there, I hope it is better and better understood. Global warming, climate change, the devastating loss of biodiversity are really the greatest threats that humanity has ever faced. And it's literally one that is largely on our own creation as we've gone there. And we've got to begin to look at the way we can begin to go and address it. Yeah, we have to begin to look at how we can go and reach the emission goals and things that were part of the Paris Agreement and how to get there and how to bring them back in place. And, you begin to look at climate change and compare it to some of the other threats. And, nuclear war, terrorism, they're big issues. But are they as big as really the potential climate change? Because climate change is a total global thing which encompasses rising temperature, extreme weather, shifting wildlife population, habitats, changes to how we grow our food, raising sea levels, and well, a dramatic impact on really our way of life, and in fact, even life itself. The level of greenhouse gases are higher now than at any point in the last 800,000 years. And it really is highlights clear that humans have brought this upon ourselves and that we have to take action now to begin to go and deal with it. We begin to see that not just first world nation, but all nations of the world need to react because they're going to be impacted on it as it goes forward. You see the different things. COP 21 really put an opportunity on the table to stem this crisis, and given that many governments of the world have agreed to limit climate change to 2 or 1.5 degrees, it still is a potential catastrophic rise in temperature. And we've got to go forward with this really daunting but an ambitious task and plan to have an impact there. The biggest problem, and one of the most important things to us as a developing nation, is yes, we as the adults, this is impacting us, but the greatest impact of this type of climate change in action is not going to be on us, but it's going to be on our children and our children's children. So this area of climate change impacts not just today, not just our country today, not just our industries, our food, our diversity. It impacts things that are yet to be born in our country. It impacts our future and the future of humanity, the future of mankind. And with that being said, that is why we really, as a government, have no choice but really to look at the fact that climate change is the greatest threat facing humanity today. And I could go back and pull quote after quote from people globally and put on the table that supports it. I can pull hundreds of scientific articles that supports this proposition. But sometimes the best approach when you look at something that's profound, this large of a grand challenge, is to keep it simple and just look at what's happening around us. Look at the new storms, look at the shortages, look at the elements, look at the rising sea levels. And those can really take the case by themselves without having to go down into the scientific numbers without it. This is a tremendously complicated change. And it's one that if we do not, as COP21 said, take action now, we're at the point where many believe it's not going to be reversible. So we have to take action now. And because of that, this is really one of the largest impacts that we have. So from the government side, I don't think we need to go even much further in this discussion because to me, it's not even a debate. The science is there, the physical evidence is there, and not just near-term impact, but long-term impact is very well defined on this topic. So thank you so much for letting the government present our opening argument.
Thank you. Thank you, Honorable Prime Minister of the Parliament, for your excellent view about climate change. Now I request Honorable Leader from the Opposition, Professor Rob.
So the House believes that climate change is the greatest threat facing humanity today, and arguing against climate change not being significant would be foolish. As I'm sure the opposition will point out, most of the studies out there that argue that there is no climate change are bogus and funded by industry. We're not going to contest that. What we are going to contest is whether climate change is the greatest threat to humanity. Looking at the Center for the Study of Existential Risk and the Lovell Holmes Center for Future Intelligence, as well as the Global Challenges Foundation, there is a consensus across those three organizations who rank the threats facing humanity. I'm going to operate off the Global Challenges Foundation just because I like their taxonomy a little bit better, but it's very similar to what the other two organizations have put forward. From their perspective, the greatest threat to humanity today is artificial intelligence, and the artificial intelligence can have an adverse impact on climate change. And the problem is machines can use an extreme amount of technology and become difficult to control. We have massive work going on to AI-driven weaponry. The threshold for impact for climate change is measured in the 50 to 100-year range. The threshold for impact of adverse artificial intelligence, and let's be clear, we're not talking Terminators here. I'm not going to go crazy with science fiction. We're simply talking about AIs that may be badly programmed and could use up vast amounts of resources at a rate that the world couldn't sustain, and certainly contribute very easily to making climate change far worse. The odds of this wiping out humanity is within the 0 to 10% range, and the timing is within 10 years. So that much more critical to humanity in terms of damage, and potentially much more dramatic in terms of our ability to address the problem. Well, one of the other issues with regard to climate change, there's very little our little country can do to correct climate change, but we could do things today to protect ourselves against hostile AI. Number two, unknown consequences. We have a lot of moving parts right now in the world. We've got a war going on right now, and the leader of Russia is promising to use nuclear weapons. the scale of weapons that Russia has in their arsenal vastly outstrip what was used in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. I mean, to a point where if you were to see it on a graph, they would be little itty bitty trees, while the capability of Russia's bombs are the equivalent of large forests. Incredibly scary. The risk of wiping out humanity is at about 0.1%. That seems small, 10th of 1%, but it's still greater in the near term than climate change. The chance of climate change wiping out humanity in 10 years is non-existent, virtually zero. But the chance of humanity being wiped out by any number of things coming out of the Ukraine is significant. Number 3 on the list: synthetic biology. We certainly were just hit by a global pandemic. There was certainly a lot of discussion about whether that pandemic owed its origins to a market in China or to the Wuhan lab in China. I would argue that there's a lot of evidence that it came out of the lab, in that the lab had been repetitively sanctioned for poor security and containment. They were doing a gain of function resource on COVID viruses, and 2 people out of that lab had flu-like symptoms about the same time that COVID stepped out. Now, I'm not arguing on COVID start. All I'm saying is, even if that was a natural source for the COVID-19 pandemic, it brought the world to its knees. We did not have adequate capability to even get our citizens to wear masks and socially distance. What if a more dangerous pathogen came out? And of course, we've got 2 biolabs in the Ukraine now at risk of being violated. The Russians were shelling nuclear plants. They blow up a biolab. Whatever is in that lab is going to spread far and wide. And once again, it's something we can do something about. We now know what we need to do to contain and control pathogens. Perhaps we should ramp our capability of doing that first, because once again, this is something that could happen in the next 2 to 3 years as opposed to the next 100. Now, number 4 on the list, just to get to where climate change is, pretty much everybody agrees. Number 4 on the list is climate change. But the issue with climate change is there's very little we can do about it. We're a small country. We need China. We need the US. We need Russia to step up. I mean, I can't even imagine the amount of damage that Russia is doing to the climate right now in their assault on the Ukraine. But once again, we have no ability to stop Russia. We have no ability to go out and put global satellites in place, or block the sun, or clean CO2 out of the atmosphere at a scale that will help the world. We just don't have the resources. So even though it's number 4, I would argue that it just isn't one of our predominant, our primary focuses to protect our civilizations, because the first 3 are probably going to kill us first. So we argue that while climate change is important and it is a critical problem for our world, the top 3 things are more important: AI, unknown consequences, which includes nuclear war, and synthetic biology, which I would argue probably moving up as I speak, thanks to the war in the Ukraine. So we argue that global warming is not the greatest threat to humanity today. It is only the 4th, and that's supported by the organizations that rank these things.
Thank you. Excellent debate by our honorable opposition leader of the parliament. When he do the debate, I just remembered my last TV debate in 2009, when we were champion, whole team against us, against student politics, but we take the positions of student politics and we become champion. This is excellent debate. I'm sure the rest of the debaters also contribute in an effective way. Now I request our Minister of the Parliament from Climate Change Department, Professor Donald.
You're muted.
Yes, can you unmute, please?
Well, Professor Rob made some great points, and I will take a little issue with him. I think that artificial intelligence is just science fiction, and that the hype has just gotten to the point where people actually believe their own hype. But that's for another discussion. one of the things that people argue is that they say that because it's not a problem right now, it's not really a problem. I think that's immoral, because if you really think about all of the wonderful things we have in the life that we live, those things are the consequence of all of our parents and our parents' parents and our grandparents and so on like that, working together to make the world better for their children. What is the point of us being the generation that says, who gives a damn about the future? Let's just let it all go. And I think that's one of the things that, even as a small country like we have, that we can be moral and understand what the consequences of this are. I have some slides I was going to show, but I think that maybe I don't really necessarily need to do that. Right now, I looked last night, and all of the research that's been shown show that 100% of all papers all agree that climate change is happening. This is obfuscated by saying that, well, scientists all get together. Peer review is just a bunch of scientists get together at a bar and they agree with each other about what they're supposed to say. But it doesn't work like that. Peer review is, it's blind. When I do peer review, I don't know who I'm reviewing, and they don't know who's reviewing me. And just be realistic. You think a scientist is going to leave his mark or her mark by doing something that somebody else has already done, just repeating something? I mean, that's replication is necessary, but that's not what's going to make a difference. There are not a single solitary peer-reviewed paper that disputes that climate change is happening. The obfuscators will tell you, well, it's always happened. It's not caused by humans. However, there has been several studies that show that not just theoretically, but in actual practice, the extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is increasing the temperatures, which increase the amount of water vapor, which is the worst, one of the worst greenhouse gases. And they work together in a kind of synergistically to make things continually worse. And if we understand the world, the poles are very, very cold, and the equator is much, much warmer. And so what happens is that as the polar regions, which are heating up much faster than the rest of the world, get warmer, what happens is that the polar regions, the cold water, some of the water freezes and it loses its salt into the water. So the water is much saltier, and it's also much colder, so it sinks, and the hotter water floats, and it creates a current where the cold water starts being drawn. And the same thing happens in the air. Since the temperature between the two has gotten more even, that process of circulation is going away. And because of that, we have things strikingly like extra cold, because the cold, I mean, even if Antarctica warms up or the Arctic warms up, it's going from minus 80 degrees to minus 60 degrees. It's still cold, but it's, that's 20 degrees hotter than normal. And it's causing all of this disruption in the weather. So this is one of the things that it's causing is the sea levels to rise, which is going to basically start destroying our cities. There's some really wonderful like interactive maps you can find that show you can find your city and see what happens with 1 or 2 feet of sea level. Right now, there's a glacier called the Thwart Glacier, which is about the size of Florida, that has been held back by sea ice. And the sea ice is melting because of the warm currents. The currents underneath it are warming up for the reasons that I just said. And that is irreversibly going to slip into the ocean and raise sea levels about about 2 meters, I think it is, about 6 feet. So basically all countries that are low lying like ours are going to get hit the worst. So now the question is, we obviously can't stop the pollution from the United States and China, but what can we do? And this is most of our people are going to have to move. And so what we need to do right now is to start planning what's possible to do. But that isn't the question. It's the question is, what's the worst threat? And when people are forced to move, they fight with each other. The people that are living in a place don't want a bunch of new people moving in. So if we add those together, I think that AI is bogus. It's not a real threat. The nuclear threat, well, I mean, it's scary, but I'm old enough to have lived through duck drills where we hid under our desks so we wouldn't get vaporized by a nuclear bomb. And I think that anyone can claim that they're the experts on what is the biggest threats. You can always start an organization and claim you know what you're doing, but futurists are almost always wrong. So the threat of global warming and climate change is real. It's happening now, and it's going to get exponentially worse every single solitary year in the future until and it's not going to stop. It's too late. So we're in very big trouble, and the only thing that we can do about it is start preparing for it now because it's real.
Thank you, Professor Donald. Now I request Deputy Leader of the Parliament, Mr. Marshall.
Right. So thank you, Sharif, for giving us this opportunity on the opposition to present our argument. As Professor Rob and the head opposition has pointed out, no one is denying the fact that climate change is an issue. The question before the House is it the greatest threat? And just to back up what Rob, the head of the opposition, has pointed out, is that if you had talked about this a few years ago, we probably all would have been on the same page. But as of today, right now, we're faced with an immediate threat that's even more immediate and then greater than climate change. There is the Russian invasion. They don't call it an invasion, but the Russian invasion of the Ukraine is obviously an immediate threat, as Professor Rob has pointed out, because Putin has determined that he's using false flag operations, as well as similar tactics that the Nazis used during World War II to start World War II in Poland. And, you know, he's a student of history. He was a mid-level KGB officer trained by the KGB. Part of that was to understand the greatest threat to the Soviet Union during that time, during World War II, was the Nazi when they turned against the Russian government. And then, of course, at Stalingrad, the Russians lost close to, I don't know how many tens of millions of people they lost, but it was huge. And so the Russians understand this kind of threat, but their reaction has always been overwhelming force at all costs. And that means humanity. So, and I think all one has to say is point to the fact that Putin has already publicly acknowledged that he's activating tactical nuclear warheads. Now, what does that mean? I've heard in the press and other places that it doesn't mean anything because in order, like in the United States, to activate a nuclear warhead, you have to go through a chain of command. However, what we do know right now, that's what's happening in the Ukraine, and it goes to the heart of the matter, that is that the Russians thought they were going to have a cakewalk by walking in and doing a blitzkrieg like the Nazis did into Poland. It didn't work out that way, and now they're ratcheting up their capabilities so much so that, as our leader in the opposition has pointed out, The Russians are already deactivating or causing problems and taking over the decision-making process in the nuclear reactors, let alone biological labs. They haven't gotten to the biological labs, but when they do, the world is in big trouble, because this is like starting a fire. And Putin, though he may have been a halfway decent KGB officer during the Soviet era, as leader of the Soviet Union, he is actually doesn't understand economics, basic economics 101. He benefited from the wealth of the Russian Federation when he became prime minister, and he immediately used that wealth to attack other nations and expand back to the Soviet Empire approach. That is what he's trying to do. So what we're seeing here is the gravest threat right now on the planet is not climate change, but is the Russian attack on Ukraine, which is likely to spread and enter into an attack on NATO. Once we have an attack on NATO, all bets are off. NATO is shown great tenacity to hold together, but kind of like what happened in the beginning of World War II, when Chamberlain went to Hitler and said, "Oh, peace in our time." So what does Putin see? He sees peace in our time. He sees the Western nations and the rest of the world as chamberlains of the world, that we're too scared because the greatest threat is nuclear weapons, and he's already threatened that. And guess what? He's also threatened false flag operations. He's saying that the United States is putting in insurgents. In the meantime, he openly calls for Syrian government insurgents from Syria that beat back from the Syrian government, that torture people, kill people. That's a threat that's greater than anything that the earth will see right now. So the opposition calls upon the government to understand that, yes, climate change is a big deal, but right now the immediate threat is war, world war. And remember, both Russia and the Ukraine is a war about resource to begin with, but it's also a war run like a Stalin-like or Hitler-like character who has obviously a social personality disorder, and he doesn't give a rat's, whatever you want to call it, about the rest of us. He only cares about himself. He doesn't even care about his people, because if he cared about his people, he wouldn't have started this war. So the greatest threat right now is Putin and his demonic attack on the rest of the world. What's remarkable about what the world is doing, and we call on our government to do the same, is align with the NATO governments and also all the Asian and sub-Saharan sub-Saharan African countries that are now beginning to recognize that food security is going to be the biggest issue, as well as nuclear and probably biological and chemical warfare that is about to come our way. Once it starts, you can't put the genie back in the bottle. So my contention is, along with the opposition, as the opposition member in this segment for me, is that the threat, the greatest threat right now to humanity is not climate change, but it is Vladimir Putin and his minions who follow him. I also want to point out one other thing why this is a dangerous thing. There's been reporting, validated, that Putin, unlike Stalin had a general by the name of Marshal Zhukov, and he was like the Dwight Eisenhower of World War II for the Allies. And Zhukov was the only person that Stalin allowed to actually have an honest discussion with. So Zhukov was not fearful of him, even though Marshal Zhukov, his daughter after the war, was incarcerated and he died. But the point is, during the war, he actually stood up to Stalin and told him what the truth was and what was going on out there. Putin has none of that. He's in a bunker like Nasrallah is in Lebanon, and he's afraid of being assassinated, and he knows he's in trouble, big trouble. But unlike somebody that said, "Oh, mea culpa, I made a mistake," he's not doing that. He has no back door to back out. The only door forward is to take over the Ukraine at all costs, and then probably go to Moldova, and then from there onward and upward. And his legacy, from his perspective, is to reinstate the Soviet Empire. That's what he's trying to do at all costs. And all costs means nuclear warfare or biological warfare or chemical warfare. They've already used chemicals, by the way, in Syria. Those chemicals didn't come just from Assad's. He did have equipment, but I think most of those chemicals came and the barrel bombs were created by the Russian military and the Russian Air Force. And already we see another thing that Putin is doing. His military has actually acknowledged that they're using these, I think they're called compression bombs or concussion bombs. They're bombs that when they're dropped, they suck out all the atmosphere out of the area that they dropped on.
Thermobaric bombs.
Thermobaric bombs. So those thermobaric bombs will just activate more death, more destruction, and the ability for people to come back from that is the trauma that it's going to cause, both psychologically, but also the deaths that it's going to cause, is the greatest challenge for the world right now. And we need to take action and work with the allies to prevent the Putin doing this. Somebody's got to deal with this, and it's up to the world to band together, because otherwise we are all going to be Chamberlains in the world. So that's my remarks on this issue.
Thank you, Mr. Marshalls, and this is very interesting debate. And first time, I believe that Mr. Marshall has to go for both oppositions and government. Now I request you, as a government's member of the parliament, for today's debate, Mr. Marshall.
So now I'm coming back as the government, right?
That's right.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to argue against my own argument and that of Rob. It's true that we have an immediate threat with the reinstatement of everything I just said in the opposition. However, there is a cartoon out there, and I'm using the cartoon because it's graphic. There's a cartoon prior to the threat of what Putin started this war 2 weeks ago that showed a little cartoon in over a city, and there were 3 tidal waves, one larger than the other. And the first tidal wave was the pandemic. And in the cartoon in this city, there's a little, you don't even see the characters. You just see the graphic that says a father talking to his son and saying, "Son, wear a mask, wash your hands, and socially distance." That's this is before they had vaccines. And then behind that pandemic tidal wave is the biodiversity tidal wave, which looks in the cartoon about twice as large as the pandemic tidal wave. And then the final tidal wave is the climate crisis. And as the leader of the government, David Smith, has pointed out, this is truly the greatest threat to humankind. Because whether Putin if Putin nukes us, yeah, we'll all be dead. But there's other issues here. There will be survivors, but those survivors won't survive the climate crisis. So the ultimate greatest threat to humankind right now is the climate crisis. And although the opposition has talked about the fact that, and with again with some data that's a little incorrect, and I'd like to point that out, the opposition has pointed out that we have a greater threat through like the pandemic as an example. But the pandemic, and people don't realize this wasn't out of a Wuhan lab. The latest report just 2 days ago that came out in China itself by third parties that went into China found that a specific market enhanced this and spread this, and and by the way, the current transmission of the new type of COVID-19 is a zoonotic disease, a disease that transmits between species. And why do those zoonotic diseases spread, and why are they more prevalent today than before? The reason they're more prevalent is because of climate change. As the climate changes, species migrate and tend to go towards areas where there's food. and food bumps up against humans, and humans themselves tend to create, let's say in sub-Saharan Africa, communities that are deeper into the pristine forests that were there and jungles. So what we're seeing is that biodiversity is being lost, as in Australia. We're seeing that the zoonotic diseases are greater and greater, and that they're caused not by just people. I mean, people cause the climate crisis, but the climate change is actually on a roll itself. It's an automatic roll, and it's taking over the world in a way that will make Putin look like small potatoes. So what we do know is that that the zoonotic diseases need to be treated. And the good news is, everybody out there, and this is reality, we can actually treat zoonotic diseases using a material known as biochar as an animal husbandry feed. So we protect our livestock, and we can also protect other species. And I'll give you an example. In New York City today, it was just announced by scientists that they believe that the COVID virus, a mutation of it, is now in the water system and the waste system of New York City. And who eats that material? Rats. It's a big city. Rats thrive there, and like in all big cities. And so they're beginning to understand that they need to measure the COVID or other zoonotic diseases in the waste treatment plants. We can treat waste treatment plants so that doesn't spread. We can treat wastewater treatment plants so that doesn't spread. We can clean up water. We can improve the soil quality, and we can also reduce the greenhouse gas emissions now. The technology exists. We just need the will and the money to do it. And we need a community to do it. That's what COP26 was about. Everybody thought COP26 was a failure, but we do know that the governments and industry have come together in spite of all the rhetoric of the climate deniers. That they're ready to issue 130 trillion US dollars to address the climate crisis. That's a lot, and by the way, it's probably half of what is needed, but that's a good start, and we can make that change now. And another example of a climate denier is Royal Dutch Shell. Prior to COP26, the EU, it's an EU business station in the Netherlands, worldwide. It's world headquarters. It was. And what happened is they were issued an injunction by the High Court in Europe, the European Union Court, to make all their locations 40% net carbon by 2025. That's a heavy lift. That's a lot of money that needs to be spent. But they've got the money. They could do it if they wanted to do it. So after COP26, what did the climate deniers do? They said, oh, well, guess what? We're no longer Royal Dutch Shell. We're Shell, and we're no longer based in the Netherlands. We're based in the UK and London. Why? So they can try to escape the consequences. But we have consequences here, and we need consequences are very grave and greater. I'm not suggesting that Putin couldn't threaten the world, and as I argued on the side previously, that it couldn't threaten the world and destroy it. But I think the world is coming together, and we need to stay focused on the climate crisis, because the climate crisis will solve the issues, the political issues of people like Putin. Because if we create greater diversity, especially in the developing world and third world countries, and give them a level playing field, the food challenge is going to be very grave because of the war in Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine produce the most amount of wheat proportionally. There are, obviously, there's the Central Valley in California and other in the Midwest in the United States. It's a great wheat producer. But for Europe and the developing world, and specifically sub-Saharan Africa, and also parts of Egypt, the wheat that they get for their food to make bread so that people can eat comes mostly from the Ukraine and Russia. So that's a problem. But that problem is going to be exacerbated by the climate crisis and by zoonotic diseases. And all of that can be addressed through the climate crisis if we address that, make that our top priority. The rest will fall in line. So that's my argument on the side of the government.
Thank you. Thank you, Honorable Member of the Parliament from government side. Thank you for your excellent contributions. Now I request from opposition side, Mr. Adam. he is opposition member of the parliament.
Thank you, Sharif. Well, climate change, whilst being an obvious topic that humanity needs to try and manage, has been overblown and overstated, when there are far more drastic and worrying existential risks to keep our eyes on, like AI, as Mr. Rob rightly said earlier. And it has become something of a cultural phenomenon more than a crisis, and it certainly is not the greatest risk to humanity's continued existence and well-being. An accolade which is more appropriate to the aforementioned AI, or nations like China, diseases, our own warlike territorial nature. Climate change has been bloated up into a convenient bandwagon for more privileged people, or people in more privileged classes and positions in society, celebrities, politicians, social engineers. Climate change has become a convenient way to impose further sanctions on less privileged people. It's become a perverse finger-wagging exercise where people and groups of people towards the tip of the pyramid can think they can impose restrictions, sanctions, moral codes, rules for ye and not for thee, basically. Kind of in a similar vein to these smug public figures brushing off the spiked fuel prices because of the Russia-Ukraine crisis with such sentiments as, yes, the astronomical sky-high fuel prices will obviously very negatively affect low-income individuals and families, but for everyone else it's an acceptable price to pay to hold Russia accountable, and so on and so forth. The smug people who come out with these kinds of ideas don't even put any effort to hide the duper's delight they're feeling, like holding in laughter. Same with the climate change topic. For the past few years and decades, it's become a culturally accepted browbeating exercise. There's a company called Doconomy that are introducing a new kind of credit card that accounts for the card owner's CO2 footprint and then tax them accordingly. I first saw this months ago, before the Ukraine-Russia crisis kicked off, while the COVID crisis was still in full swing. And I think the first stirrings of Doconomy's new bright idea came out when countries like Austria were imposing these harsh COVID-related sanctions, and I thought, the ordinary man, woman and family have more than enough on their plate to worry about already, to say nothing of adding a carbon tax to already stretched people juggling plates such as COVID, money and fiscal taxation, and then carbon taxation. Furthermore to what I was saying about class against class blaming other classes, if people like philanthropists, millionaires, billionaires care so much about climate change, then the biggest onus should fall on them. The main locus of change should be on them. Most of the responsibility should fall on their shoulders. People like Gates, Bezos, wealthy celebs flying on aeroplanes to attack the lifestyles of ordinary people, demanding that the little people should never step foot in an aeroplane ever again, before said rich celeb flies back home feeling pleased with themselves. I also think it is very audacious to make excessive demands on billions of ordinary lower and middle class people to remedy climate change when there is so much interest in oil and limited natural resources that people benefiting in those industries the most are prepared to do despicable things to innovators and inventors, people who posed a threat to the lucrative winnings of fossil fuel industries, people who have made discoveries and innovations in clean energy, free energy, more eco-friendly alternatives, have been whacked, disappeared, assassinated, killed for daring to make actual sincere paradigm shifts. It was part of the reason hemp was made illegal about a century ago, and they blamed it a lot on Mexicans smoking it, but a big reason was because it posed a threat to the cash cow of fossil fuel. And then in the same breath, ordinary people are browbeaten into changing their lifestyles with demands that are performative, insincere, because if they were sincere, philanthropists and investors would right the many wrongs committed by the fossil fuel industries anyway. So it's an illusion, really. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Mr. Adam. Now I request for rebuttal and closing remarks. First, I request a leader from the opposition side, Mr. Rob.
Well, the opposition does not believe that climate change is the greatest threat facing humanity today. And as mentioned, the organizations that have been built to track the risks against humanity place it at best fourth and often fifth on the list, predominantly because of the inability for any single nation to address the problem and the length of time we're talking about. The adverse impacts of climate change at an extreme level are still being placed at the 50-year to 100-year level. The Ukrainian war is a current event, and is currently showcasing both a risk of biological weapons release and a risk of nuclear weapons release. Whether you believe that the Hunan market in China or the lab was the source of COVID-19, what you can't dispute is it was not an official release of a bioweapon. They tracked it down to 1 or 2 people as the beginning, and then from there it spread to the world. In a military release of a bioweapon, the initial infection rate would be far higher and spread far faster. And we weren't able to deal with the slow progression of the COVID-19 virus. We are in no way, shape, or form able to deal with a virus that was specifically designed to do harm and was released as a bioweapon on purpose, infecting millions of people out of the gate and being virtually immediately containment proof. So whether you're talking about nuclear attack, whether you're talking about bioweapon attack, whether you're talking about the threat of AIs, I noticed that the government was skeptical about where AIs are. Let me inform the government that AIs are being built into weapon systems as I speak, so much so that an organization has been created to try to ban or stop the use of AI in weapon systems. We haven't, surprisingly, seen them used yet on the battlefield in Ukraine. But the very idea of, by the way, they are being used on the border of North and South Korea and are being deployed on the border between the U.S. and Mexico. And one of the other AI complaints or risks is once you get to critical mass of these AI-driven weapon systems and they form digital communities, a bad piece of code, a hack, any type of problem with those AIs could result in them going rogue. And if there are enough of them, containing those things again could be a problem. And that's not even the high profile risk with the AIs. That's just one of the more obvious. We're putting AIs in our nuclear plants and our grid. We're putting them across our food ecosystem. We're talking about trucks and cars having artificial intelligence and then being connected. And it's not the individual AIs that come into play, or even the creation of hostile AIs. It's the potential when you have massive amounts of machines that don't have human supervision. Simply a coding error can create catastrophic effects. And yet we are not developing. There are two, to my knowledge, there are only 2 efforts currently in existence to mitigate this: the AI shield efforts backed by Google and the Lifeboat Foundation. There has been a new group. I should say that there's been a new group that was just recently formed by a group of scientists that are now working against this threat as well, because it's this aggregation of AIs that now becomes the problem, and the probability of these things conversing with each other and either spreading malware or bad code, resulting in the same effect. But whatever it is, climate change just simply isn't the first. Generally, it's ranked 4th. Often it's ranked 5th. And fundamentally, as a government, there's very little we can do other than mitigate the effects of climate change in terms of addressing the problem. We're just simply too small. So even if it was number 1, our priorities have to focus on the more immediate needs, which would likely have to do with things having to do with the effects of climate change, like food migrations and the lack of food for our citizens. So we wouldn't focus on eliminating climate change itself. We would focus on mitigating the effects of climate change anyway. And many of those same things would also address the higher end concerns, like protecting our food supply and making sure that bioweapons don't get into that food supply. Would also help assure food supply in the face of climate change. So the opposition argues that climate change is not the greatest threat facing humanity today. At best, it's fourth or fifth. And our concerns with war in Ukraine should be much more tied to the kinds of things that could come out of that war, a nuclear release, and certainly be training our people on what to do in case of a radiation plume or a bioweapon release, and making sure we harden our country against bioweapons and pathogens. But whether they're released naturally or released as a result of this war could easily overwhelm our capability today. The opposition is focused on saving the population. We're not arguing that climate change is real, and we aren't arguing against the fact that we should do something about it. We're just suggesting the priorities should be adjusted to deal with the threats that we're going to be facing in the next 5 or 10 years, and not the threats we're going to be facing in the next 50 to 100.
Thank you, Opposition Leader of the Parliament. Now I request for the closing remarks from Honorable Prime Minister, Professor David Smith.
Well, thank you so much, and it's been very interesting to hear the opposition's remarks on this. In fact, with the eloquent close they did, I believe it's appropriate for this government to actually go ahead and appoint the Honorable Opposition Leader Rob to actually go and serve as you're laughing too much, as a special ambassador between Ukraine and Russia, to be able to apply his persuasive argument to eliminating the threat of the nuclear and biological warfare. And what's interesting about that is even though you say that almost in jest, the impact our nation could have in preventing that threat, which is a threat, from happening is limited. And even though the fallout from those activities in the Ukraine would be severe, they will not have as much potential long-term effect as what we see with climate change. And even a nuclear exchange, the biggest effect from a nuclear change is a global winter, which is climate change. So you begin to see that the elements really go in there and can support each other. And, you know, the climate change crisis is the biggest social, political, economic, and environmental problem facing our planet and its inhabitants. It affects every country, every species. And it really has those type of impacts. You know, we're becoming increasingly concerned about the climate crisis and its consequences, despite there is corporate misinformation. There's media misinformation that is going there. And, you know, we see those elements. I just would like to finish with a couple of key points and try not to go too far into them. But Sharif, can we bring up this slide?
Yeah, sure.
One of the things as you begin to look at climate change is there really is tremendous glowing scientific background into it. And, you know, you look at the evidence and it's unequivocal. You know, just let's go back and look at all the years before this. And then at that sharp spike that we have there. So, yes, the world has gone through cycles. And we'll continue to go cycles, but this climate change might be one that we can never return past that baseline where we saw it before. And that's going into just the pure scientific areas. So just to kind of wrap it up, we know there's global temperature rise. We know there's a warming ocean. We know there's shrinking ice sheets, global glacial retreats. The sea level is rising, and there's extreme events all over the globe now. And these are here. You know, the opposition has said, gee, let's try to control what Putin does. Well, there is considerable world effort being presented to him. You know, the opposition says he wants to return to the former glory of the Russian Empire. He does. But on the other hand, if he were to use nuclear weapons as part of that, it would be land that he could not occupy. And so the common sense of the Russian leadership around him most likely will stop in. You look at the intelligence that has been shared with our nation. It shows that there's increasing opposition, even within the military branches, to any extreme action he's going to do. And even his largest ally, who is in this, the intelligence that was released today by UK and others show that even China is backing down from their alliance with him because of the brutality he has shown in Ukraine. They're backing down because of the red flags and false flags he's beginning to set and others. So he is rapidly becoming nothing but an island, and the global forces will stop him. As you look at that, is it a threat? Yes, it's a threat, but it's a threat that can be managed and reversed. The problem with climate change today is if action is not taken soon, it cannot be reversed. And that's the biggest challenge that we, as a government, as a people, face with climate change, is we're at that tipping point. And if something is not done, it's over. And it's going to take a global response to that tipping point. If you look, for example, China is the largest contributor to greenhouse gases, and they began pulling back, and others, but we each have to do our part. And this is something that our nation can handle. It might be good to have the observation leader go and become a negotiator in the Ukraine conflict. Special military operation. But as you begin to try to see that, yes, I think it's horrible. The atrocities are, I believe, war crimes, as we've seen them. And we have bodies in place for dealing with war crimes. We have people already beginning to push them back from both the biological and nuclear edge. And we can do that. Artificial intelligence is a tool that needs to be managed, and we all know that. But, in our nation, all of our computers have on and off switches. And if we begin to see artificial intelligence getting too strong, let's just turn them off and begin to look at them. So if I go back to our general premise again, that this House really believes that climate change is really one of the greatest threats facing humanity today. And the key word in there is humanity. The other elements we have, we will deal with, and we will put the systems in place around them and do it. But we have to look at it, even as we look at inside the EU and its impacts from the current war. The oil, the other elements, having to go back and use new sources where cleaner ones are cut off are going to impact the climate. So whether we like it or not, the climate change is impacted by all the other elements that the opposition has been putting on the table. Are they all bad? Yes. Should we work against them? Yes. And even the studies which the opposition cited were, what are the near-term challenges? Not what are the things that are that can really wipe out humanity over a long scale and can change it. And like I said, the biggest risk of climate change is to our children and our children's children. And we have to be the responsible adults and take the actions today as a responsible government to do our part in eliminating this future impact we have on climate change to our health, to our nation, to our economy, and really just to our way of life. So thank you so much for allowing us this debate. It's timely. The world environment around us, yes, it's chaotic. You see many signs today, as the opposition said, that Putin is acting pretty much by himself. And if you go back and use history as a barometer, oftentimes smart people step up and will stop a dictator from acting in ways that can cause catastrophic harm. Our hope is that happens in this instance. But thank you so much for allowing us to really go in there and not only talk about it, but show scientific evidence of its impact. And the extreme impact is in the chart, where that increase is just a straight line up on orders of magnitude greater and greater than we've ever seen in the history of recorded data on this planet. So thank you so much for allowing us to do this debate.
Thank you, Honorable Prime Minister of the Parliament, and I want to give thanks to all of our speakers for your excellent contribution for today's debate, because you bring climate change, you bring present crisis, artificial intelligence related problem, you bring where this is excellent example of a class debate. And I believe our youth community can learn many interesting points, how to analyze a topic, how to develop the arguments, and how to structure a argument in a proper way. I think our youth community can understand. As well as you already know that World Talent Economy Forum, we are working with developing nations, many countries, many universities, school, uh, college, as well as different think tank, government body. They are collaborating with us. I believe this kind of debate actually a very good example for social logical improvement. We have our analyst, debate analyst, Professor Paul. He can analyze the whole debate from his views. Professor Paul.
Yes, thank you, everybody, for your comments, and Sharif for putting this together. First, I was going to say I think that both sides, win, and then I thought, well, no, both sides lose actually, and I thought, okay, well, maybe it's a draw or a stalemate or a zugzwang. A zugzwang would be that any further argument on either side weakens the position of that side. That would be a zugzwang. I think that timescales are obviously important, and climate change is definitely a huge factor. People have been saying, and the military, in fact, says that climate change is a threat multiplier. So any of the threats that seem unrelated to climate change, we could go and argue that climate change is embedded in these threats. So it's part of all of these threats. So, we're trying to compare, one threat to the other, and yet climate change is part of all of these threats. So it's, it makes a sort of a debate over it a bit moot, maybe. We have to look at what we mean by threat as well. Like, normally one would talk about risk. You can analyze risk, and risk is, of course, it's the probability of something happening times the impact of or the consequences if that thing does happen. And you can talk about, when we say threat, are we really talking about the risk, or are we really talking about the impact or the consequences if something happens? When we talk about a threat, it seems to me it could be either, but it's mostly probably just the impact or the consequences. So it wouldn't have that probability effect inherent. A couple specific points. I think that Donald is a robot, okay? And the evidence I have is that, one, he's not worried at all about AI. He completely discounts AI. So if he's a robot, that makes perfect sense. He's trying to downplay his position. And the other line of evidence that makes me think Donald's a robot is that we talked about climate change and the poles warming and the equalization of temperature and the extreme weather events and so on. And that's exactly what I've been talking about with my climate videos for over a decade. I think that we definitely climate change. We've changed the chemistry of our atmosphere and oceans. David pointed out that graph showing the CO2 levels over time, and we've because we've changed the chemistry of the atmosphere and oceans, we've changed how they respond to the heat coming to the Earth, the sunlight, and we've changed the way that heat is distributed over the Earth, the amount that is in the oceans and the atmosphere, how the global circulation patterns, whether they be in the atmosphere or oceans, those things have all changed. And we've basically, if you think about it, we've basically torn the fabric of nature itself, the fabric of nature on this planet. And we're having all kinds of consequences as a result of that. So, personally, from my climate work, I fully expect that we will lose the Arctic sea ice, in say 5 to 10 years. It'll be gone in the summers, so that it's going to be an abrupt jump in this heat balance disruption between the poles and the equator, so that the weather patterns, which we're already seeing, many extreme weather patterns, we're getting increases in the frequency, severity, and duration of extreme weather events. And they're happening also, these events, in locations where they never happened before. And this is already starting to disrupt the global food supply. So I fully expect, as the Arctic sea ice goes in the 5 to 10 years, that it will lead to global crop failures on a massive scale, leading to global famine, leading, of course, to huge geopolitical unrest and lots of starvation. So all of these factors, but there's also many other factors in play. Of course, right now we're facing a nuclear crisis, and yet, if I asked you about the threat from of a nuclear crisis 4 weeks ago, you would have said it's extremely low and discounted it. And yet here we are, after Putin's war and his threats of tactical nukes and strategic nukes and et cetera, and it's at the top of all our minds. So I would argue, so this is these sort of factors are high risk events now. Okay, so the probability has become much higher, for example, of nuclear war just in the last 3 weeks. The impact, of course, of nuclear war is a nuclear winter and the possible destruction of all civilizations. So the impact is enormous, and the probability has flipped completely in the space of just weeks. Okay, so we can talk about all of these threats from our armchairs, but as time progresses and as things happen, things can flip immediately and become much more grave and serious in a matter of weeks or less. If I asked you a couple of years ago about the gravest threat, you would have argued that the pandemic was the gravest threat. I mean, the risk that there would be a variant that would kill, huge percentage of the people and spread everywhere. Okay, that type of variant, which fortunately we haven't had, has lowered the risk. And now you would say that the risk of the pandemic is much lower to society. Of course, terrorism, is a risk, but Europe's dealt with terrorism for years and years. It only became a new thing to America, after 9/11. Okay, human beings are very emotional. Our psychology is very emotional, and that competes with the rational parts of our brain. Not perfect competition, but it's certainly the emotional part can overrule any of the logical parts. Some things that have very low probabilities of occurrence for example, that nobody's mentioned are, we can argue about all of this, and then say Yellowstone supervolcano goes and erupts on us and wipes out most of the U.S. and causes a nuclear winter type effect, right? By sending all these particles aloft, which then causes global crop failures, and basically we collapse. So that sort of thing, and this may be it has been mentioned indirectly as unknown consequences, but it's more than unknown consequences. It's unknown triggers, unknown events that then cause unknown consequences. So I would argue that the Global Challenges Foundation, just saying unknown consequences, should also include unknown events. Nobody's talked about a meteor strike. We're monitoring most bolides, objects in space that can threaten, Earth by coming into our orbits. But if they're coming from the sun, we can't really see them that well. So, we could see it and say, oh, it's going to hit us in like a few weeks, sort of thing. It's something right now we have very limited ability to measure. So that would be a huge impact and huge threat. Like, it could take out the planet, everybody on the planet. But the probability of that is very, very low. And when we try to calculate a risk based on a very low probability and a very high impact, that's where our assessments, are very inaccurate. And in the ice core records, we have evidence of massive solar storms, coronal discharges from the sun. And an event like that could just happen, right, without being known in advance, and it doesn't take many minutes for that signal to get from the sun to the Earth, and that could completely wipe out all of our global communication systems. So we could worry about Putin and the war, and we could have a solar storm coronal discharge being triggered, and all communication drops around the world, and you can push buttons all you want, nothing's going to happen. Right? I mean, if one of this happened, just before, we were about to go into a nuclear war, that war wouldn't happen because nobody has any communications or electronics at all. And, AI, I guess you could fear AI because of the risk. Some great thinkers like Stephen Hawking and, other people, Elon Musk, I guess other people, are saying, yeah, AI is a huge threat to humanity. And maybe that's a good thing, because if humanity is destroying our planet, which takes down all of the plants and animals on our planet, then if AI just took out humans, that would give the planet the ability to recover. And things could evolve again, and maybe other sentient species could come along in the future. The whole planet wouldn't be destroyed, right? So AI, and if you asked AI, if you had the ultimate AI and you asked it, how do you solve the climate crisis? Its answer would probably be get rid of the humans, right? So we should think above and beyond just threats to humanity. We should think about threats to the entire planet, and that changes the equations quite a bit. So, yeah, I think the debate was well done on both sides. I think it's essentially a draw or a stalemate, because we really need to focus on time frames of things happening, and climate change isn't out there 50 years or 100 years. It could bring global famine extremely fast. Which would be, and also, you need to look at all of the feedbacks between the different systems. I mean, you need to look at the cascading events that can happen, one thing causing another thing, like just a, very simple example, climate change causes global food shortages. We can't grow food. So then there's authoritarianism and populism occurring in many countries. Many governments go fascist, and then there's war, and then nukes are dropped, and it takes out humanity. So this is all of these different things happening. We've talked about all of them, but the way they're all connected, intimately connected, is a grave risk to all of us. So, so thank you very much for the topic. It was great.
Thank you, Professor Paul. Thank you, all of our speakers, for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. This is our 501 episode. This debating actually a very great example for the youth communities that how they can develop their argument. Climate change definitely a big problem. Now we are observing where artificial intelligence, many interesting thing what actually Professor Rob bring to this debate. Uh, this is also very great threat for us. Even personally, I believe that we can overcome many of these threats if we work together and if we can develop a more transparent and trustworthy relationship in between developed world and developing worlds, because we need to work together to solving all of the complex problem, because these are the very complex things. And definitely debate is something actually what we observe actually a classic debate in the parliament. Even personally, I believe that the more uh, honest and sincere and dedicated politicians join in the politics, uh, we get better outcome. We get we do not have to see at least this kind of war. We do not have to see it's too much of complexity with these climate change issues or artificial intelligence related problem. So we need great policymakers. Debate is the way how we can promote a logical things. So I believe that if in our real parliament we get this kind of politicians, those who can think logically, and those who can promote this kind of debate inside parliament, then we can solve many problems together. And another things, World Talent Economy Forum really want to focus on modern science, engineering, and technology. We are publishing papers, research papers. So we are working with MDPI. So from our speakers, those who want to work with us as a guest editors, maybe we can promote more issues. Maybe we can promote issue on artificial intelligence or climate change. So this way we can really inspire scientific communities in developing world. And third things that we want to offer different kind of courses. So if you want to join with us, because already many big communities from developing nations, from Malaysia, only in Malaysia, uh, around 3,000 mosques they are joining. They want to tie up with us, and they want to develop the different kind of modern curriculum with World Talent Economy Forum from India, from Bangladesh, from Pakistan, from Indonesia, from China, from Africa, even from Middle East, many countries, many think tank, NGO, education institution, they are joining. So if you want to offer some courses, especially from our speakers, you can offer. I'm open for all of your good proposals. So as we are offering high quality research as well as some training and development as an academy, I think your contributions will be very helpful for World Talent Economy Forum. This debate is also very helpful for us, and we are organizing our next largest summit and conference next year February, Nikola Tesla Technologies. So we it will be hybrid. So those who want to join online, 100% you can join online. Those who want to go to India, they can go to India. So this is the way we can take positive impact in the real world. There are a lot of problems. So that's why we are requesting to the developed world, stop this kind of war or investment in this industry. Better you can invest in education, healthcare, solving climate change, doing more research, and this way we can develop a real peaceful world. World Talent Economy Forum always want to support global peace. So today's debate actually excellent example for our youth communities how to do debate. Thank you, Professor Rob, Mr. Marshall, Professor David Smith, Professor Donald, Professor Paul, and Mr. Adam for your continuous support for World Talent Economy Forum. And thank you all of our audience. Please share our content as much as possible with your audience. Thank you. Bye bye and take care.
Thank you, Sharif.